The night was supposed to be just another routine stop, but what happened next would leave an entire police department in shock. It all started on a quiet evening when FBI Captain James Carter, a well-respected officer with years of experience, was driving through a small town on his way home. Dressed in plain clothes and behind the wheel of his unmarked car, he wasn't looking for trouble, just a smooth ride back after a long day. But as he approached an intersection, flashing red and blue lights suddenly filled his rearview mirror. A local patrol car pulled him over. At first, Carter assumed it was a simple misunderstanding. Maybe they thought he ran a stop sign or had a broken taillight. But the moment the officer stepped out of his cruiser, something felt off. The cop, a young man with an intimidating stance, approached the car aggressively, tapping on the window harder than necessary. "License and registration," the officer barked, his tone sharp and commanding. Carter remained calm, as he had been trained to do in high-pressure situations. "Sure, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" The officer's jaw tightened. "I said license and registration. Now." Something about the way he spoke wasn't right. There was no explanation, no professionalism, just hostility. Still, Carter complied, slowly reaching for his wallet. That's when a second officer approached, hand resting on his holster. The tension in the air thickened. "Step out of the vehicle," the first cop ordered. Carter hesitated. "Can you tell me what this is about?" Instead of answering, the officer yanked the door open. In that moment, Carter knew this wasn't a routine stop. It was something else, something uglier. As he stepped out, the second officer suddenly pulled his gun. "Hands where I can see them," he shouted. Carter froze, his years of training kicking in. He knew how dangerous this situation could get, even though he had done nothing wrong. He raised his hands slowly, keeping his movements controlled. The officers exchanged a glance. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" One of them sneered. "You don't belong here." Carter took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I'm a federal agent," he said evenly. "I need you to lower your weapon." But instead of backing off, they laughed. "A federal agent," the first officer mocked. "Yeah, right, nice try." The situation was spiraling. Carter could see it in their eyes. They weren't interested in the truth. They had already made up their minds about who he was. And then, just as things seemed like they were about to take a dangerous turn, something happened that neither officer saw coming, something that would change everything in an instant. What happened next left the entire department speechless. Stay tuned to find out. Carter stood still, his hands raised, heart pounding but face calm. He had faced life-threatening situations before, but this one was different. He wasn't dealing with armed criminals or dangerous fugitives. He was staring down the barrels of guns held by men who were supposed to be on the same side as him. The younger officer tightened his grip on his weapon, eyes filled with suspicion. "A federal agent, huh?" he scoffed. "You got any proof of that, or are you just making things up?" Carter knew how this worked. He had seen situations like this play out before, and they didn't always end well. His every move had to be careful, controlled. One wrong gesture, one misunderstanding, and things could escalate beyond his control. "My badge is in my jacket pocket," he said evenly. "I'm going to reach for it, slowly." The older officer, still gripping his gun, gave him a cold glare. "Keep your hands where they are." Carter stayed frozen. "I understand. But if you check my inside pocket, you'll find my identification." The two officers hesitated, exchanging a look. Carter could tell they weren't expecting him to remain this calm. They wanted him to react, to slip up, to give them a reason to justify their hostility. But he wasn't going to give them that. The younger cop finally stepped closer, one hand still on his weapon as he reached into Carter's jacket. A moment later, he pulled out the leather badge holder and flipped it open. His expression shifted slightly, but instead of admitting their mistake, he just glanced back at his partner. "What is this?" the officer muttered, his tone still skeptical. This could be fake. Carter exhaled slowly. He had seen this reaction before. Some people couldn't accept the truth, even when it was right in front of them. "Check the credentials," Carter said. "Call it in if you have to." The older officer narrowed his eyes, clearly uncomfortable, but instead of verifying the badge, he turned to Carter with a smirk. "You think that means you're above the law? You think flashing some badge gets you special treatment?" Carter held his gaze, refusing to react to the provocation. "It means I know the law," he replied firmly, "and I know when it's being abused." The words hung in the air like a challenge. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing things had gone too far, but the older one wasn't backing down. "You don't belong here," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Carter to hear. Carter clenched his jaw. He had spent his entire career upholding justice, working alongside officers from every level of law enforcement. But moments like this reminded him that not everyone in the system was there to serve and protect. Before anyone could say another word, the radio on the older officer's shoulder crackled to life. A voice came through, tense and urgent. "Unit 12, what's your status? We just got a report of an FBI agent being detained. What's going on?" Both officers went stiff. Their expressions flickered with something Carter had been waiting for, realization. But the night wasn't over yet, and Carter knew that this was just the beginning. The radio call changed everything. The officers exchanged a nervous glance, their confidence flickering for just a second. But instead of admitting their mistake, the older cop pressed the button on his radio, his voice sharp. "Dispatch, we're handling the situation. Stand by." Carter caught the hesitation in his voice. He wasn't just dealing with officers who had made a bad call. He was dealing with men who didn't want to be wrong. That made them dangerous. The younger officer looked uneasy now, shifting on his feet. Carter could see the doubt creeping into his eyes, but the older one wasn't ready to back down. Instead, he turned to Carter, his jaw tight. "You must think you're real important, huh?" His tone was lower now, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "Flashing that badge like it gives you power over us." Carter held his gaze. "That badge means I enforce the law, same as you." The officer scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah. Then why don't you act like it? FBI or not, this is *** town. You don't get to just walk in here and act like you run things." Carter exhaled, keeping his voice steady. "I was just passing through. You're the ones who stopped me." The younger officer swallowed hard, his fingers twitching near his holster. Carter could tell he was starting to question things, but he wasn't sure if that doubt would help or hurt the situation. "Sir," the younger officer finally said, his voice quieter. "Maybe we should just verify his credentials and move on." But the older cop wasn't listening. His anger was personal now. Carter had dealt with men like him before, officers who saw their badge as a symbol of control, not duty. "You think I don't know what's going on," the officer continued. "People like you come in here, acting like we're the problem, like we don't know how to do our jobs." Carter clenched his jaw, but didn't take the bait. You could feel the tension thickening, and the last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation. Then, in the distance, another set of flashing lights appeared. A black SUV rolled up, moving slow and steady. The moment the officers saw it, their postures changed. The arrogance, the bravado, it all wavered. Carter recognized the vehicle immediately. It belonged to his unit. The SUV pulled to a stop, and a tall man in a suit stepped out, Special Agent Mark Reynolds. Carter had worked with him for years, and if he was here now, it meant things were about to take a serious turn. Reynolds walked up with purpose, his ID already in hand. He didn't waste time. "What's going on here?" His voice was calm but firm. The older officer squared his shoulders. This man was acting suspicious, so we stopped him for questioning. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious how?" The officer hesitated, just for a second, but that second was enough. Reynolds glanced at Carter, who gave him a slight nod. No words were needed. Reynolds could already tell what was happening. You do realize you just detained a federal officer at gunpoint without cause, right? Reynolds continued, his tone sharper now. The younger officer took a small step back, his discomfort growing, but the older one held his ground. We were just doing our jobs. Reynolds exhaled, shaking his head. No, you were abusing your power. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Carter could feel a shift. Things were changing, but the real fallout hadn't hit yet. The question now was, would these officers admit what they had done, or were they about to dig themselves into an even deeper hole? The air between them was heavy, almost suffocating. No one moved. The younger officer's fingers twitched near his belt, as if he was debating whether to unclip his radio or just step away entirely. The older officer, however, was locked in a silent standoff with Reynolds. His expression was hard, his pride refusing to bend. Carter could see it, the realization sinking in, the internal battle raging inside the man. But he also knew some people would rather go down fighting than admit they were wrong. Reynolds took a slow step forward, his voice calm but unshakable. You had a chance to de-escalate this, to verify his credentials and move on. But instead, you pulled your weapon on a federal agent. That's a serious mistake. The older officer clenched his jaw. We didn't know he was FBI at first. And when you found out, Reynolds pressed, you still kept your gun on him. You refused to confirm his credentials, and now you're trying to justify it. Silence. The younger officer's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. He looked at Carter, then back at Reynolds. His breathing had changed, slightly quicker, more uncertain. Carter finally spoke, his voice even. Do you really want to go down this road? The older officer let out a breath through his nose, nostrils flaring. I was doing my job. Your job. Reynolds shook his head. Your job is to protect and serve. But you saw a man you didn't recognize and assumed the worst. And now, instead of owning up to it, you're doubling down. The younger officer finally took a small step back. Maybe we should just. Before he could finish, another voice cut through the air. Captain Carter. A second black SUV had arrived, and this time, it wasn't just Reynolds stepping out. A woman in a crisp, dark suit strode toward them, her ID flashing in the dim light. Deputy Director Michelle Harris. Carter had worked under her for years, and as she was here, things had just escalated to a whole new level. The officers stiffened. The older one's confidence faltered, just for a second, but Carter caught it. Harris was a high-ranking official, someone whose authority couldn't be ignored. She didn't waste time. What's the situation here? Reynolds spoke first. These officers detained Captain Carter at gunpoint, despite him identifying himself as FBI. Even after verifying his badge, they refused to de-escalate. Harris' eyes flicked to the officers, her gaze sharp. Is that true? The younger cop hesitated, but the older one straightened his back. We had reason to believe he was a threat. Harris' expression didn't change. What threat? What exactly did he do? The officer opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. Carter could see it happening, the realization, the fear of consequences, the silent calculation of whether to keep pushing or finally back down. And then, just as the silence stretched long enough to crack the tension, another voice came through the radio, a voice that changed everything. Dispatch to all units. Urgent request. We have a situation unfolding at. The call was cut off, static filling the air. But it was enough. Carter saw it in their eyes. The officers were seconds away from making a choice that would define everything that happened next. The radio crackled again, but this time, the dispatcher's voice was laced with urgency. All units, respond immediately. Possible armed suspect, shots fired near downtown. Officers on scene requesting backup. The younger cop's head snapped toward his partner, his expression shifting. The weight of the situation they had created was crushing down on him. They had spent the last 20 minutes detaining a federal officer instead of doing their job. And now there was real danger unfolding elsewhere. Carter saw the moment hesitation turned into fear. The older officer's fingers twitched, his pride warring with reality. He had fought so hard to maintain control of the situation, but now something bigger was happening. Harris stepped in, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Then what are you still doing here?" The question hung in the air, pressing down on both officers. The younger one didn't wait. He turned toward their patrol car, muttering, "We should go." But the older cop stayed frozen, jaw clenched, fists tightening at his sides. His pride wasn't letting him walk away so easily. Carter could see it, the frustration, the stubborn refusal to admit fault. And just when it seemed like the officer might lash out one last time, another voice interrupted. "Agent Carter." A third vehicle had pulled up, this one unmarked but unmistakable to those who knew. A black sedan with tinted windows, the kind used for high-level officials. The back door opened, and out stepped a man in a sleek grey suit. Carter felt his stomach tighten. He wasn't expecting him. Special Agent Robert Whittaker, Internal Affairs. The moment Whittaker's polished shoes hit the pavement, the air shifted again. If Harris' arrival had been a warning, Whittaker's was something else entirely. He wasn't here to defuse the situation, he was here to investigate it. The officers went stiff. Even Reynolds tensed slightly. Whittaker was known for being methodical, cold, and relentless when it came to rooting out misconduct. If he was here, this wasn't just an internal report waiting to be filed. This was serious. Whittaker adjusted his tie, his gaze flicking from Carter to Harris, then finally to the two officers. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something calculating in his eyes. "Well," he said smoothly, his voice calm but firm, "looks like we have a situation." The older officer straightened, trying to regain his composure. "We were just..." Whittaker held up a hand, silencing him instantly. Then he turned to Carter. "Captain, are you all right?" Carter nodded once. "I'm fine." Whittaker's sharp gaze lingered on him for a moment, as if assessing whether that was the truth. Then he turned his attention back to the officers. "You two," he said, his tone unwavering. "I need your names, badge numbers, and a detailed explanation of what exactly happened here tonight." The older officer stiffened, his confidence draining by the second. The younger one looked down, suddenly interested in his boots. Whittaker continued, his voice cool, but with an edge of finality. "Because right now, it looks like a federal officer was unlawfully detained at gunpoint. And that is something I take very seriously." The silence that followed was deafening. Carter could see it now. This wasn't just about him anymore. The situation had spiraled into something much bigger. The arrival of Internal Affairs meant this wasn't going away quietly. The officers weren't just facing a reprimand. They were facing an investigation, one that could determine their entire careers. But even as the weight of Whittaker's words settled in, Carter couldn't shake a feeling creeping up his spine. Something about this still wasn't right. And then, as if the night hadn't twisted enough, Whittaker's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and his expression darkened. Without a word, he turned to Harris, his voice lower but urgent. "We need to talk." No. Carter exchanged a glance with Reynolds. This wasn't just about the officers anymore. Something bigger was happening. And whatever it was about to change everything. Harris and Whittaker stepped a few feet away, speaking in hushed tones, their expressions tense. Carter tried to read their body language, but something about Whittaker's urgency unsettled him. This wasn't just about the officers anymore. Something bigger was at play. The older cop, still standing stiffly, turned to Carter, his face unreadable now. His anger had faded into something else, an unease that mirrored what Carter was feeling. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to realize that he had been so focused on his own pride that he hadn't seen the bigger picture. Then Whittaker turned back, his voice sharp and direct. "Captain Carter, you need to come with us. Now." Carter frowned. "What's going on?" Woodtaker's eyes flicked to the two officers, then back to Carter. "We've been monitoring a situation, and we just got confirmation. There's a leak inside the department. Someone's been feeding information to organized crime. And based on what we've just uncovered, this stop," he gestured at the two cops, "it wasn't random." Carter's pulse spiked. "What are you saying?" Harris stepped in, her voice lower but just as serious. "We think someone inside law enforcement tipped off a suspect that an FBI agent was in town. Your location was compromised before you even got here." Carter's mind raced. He hadn't told anyone he was passing through this area. His route wasn't part of an official assignment. Yet, these officers had stopped him almost immediately, acting aggressive and defensive, as if they were trying to keep him from something. Then it clicked. This wasn't just a case of power-hungry cops harassing a federal agent. This was something more calculated. Carter turned to the older officer, studying his face. "Who gave you the order to stop me?" The officer stiffened. "What?" Carter stepped closer. "You heard me. Who told you to stop me tonight?" The younger officer's eyes darted between them, his panic rising. We just saw you and thought." "No," Carter cut him off. "You were waiting. That wasn't a routine stop. Someone told you to pull me over." The older officer's face darkened, but he didn't respond. He didn't have to. The hesitation said everything. Reynolds took a step forward. "You were stalling him." The younger cop's breathing hitched. I didn't know that's what we were doing." His voice was almost pleading now. "We were just told to hold him up for a bit. That's it. I swear." Carter's stomach twisted. "Well, what was happening?" Woodtaker answered, his voice grim. "While a hit was being carried out across town." A cold chill ran down Carter's spine. He turned back to the patrol car, eyes narrowing. These officers might not have been the masterminds, but they were part of something they didn't even fully understand. The older officer's mouth opened, as if he was about to deny it. But then his radio crackled again. This time, the dispatcher's voice was frantic. "All units. Shots fired at City Hall. Multiple suspects on the run. Possible inside job. FBI agents requested on site immediately." Carter didn't need to hear anything else. Without another word, he turned and sprinted toward the black SUV. Woodtaker and Harris were already moving, while Reynolds barked orders into his radio. The two officers, left standing by their patrol car, looked frozen, trapped between their past mistakes and the reality of what was unfolding. As Carter climbed into the vehicle, he couldn't shake one thought. The stop wasn't just a delay. It was a distraction. And now, because of it, something much worse had just begun. The SUV tore down the street, sirens blaring as Carter gripped the edge of his seat, his mind racing. He kept replaying everything that had just happened. The stop, the hesitation in the officers' voices, the way they had stalled him for just long enough. It all pointed to one thing. Someone inside law enforcement had set this up. And now, people at City Hall were paying the price. Woodtaker sat beside him, his phone pressed to his ear. "I want every available agent at the scene now. Lock down every exit. If this was an inside job, they won't be far." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that told Carter this wasn't just about catching a few criminals. This was about exposing something much deeper. As they neared City Hall, flashing lights illuminated the street. Officers and agents were already swarming the building, securing the area. Carter's eyes scanned the crowd, searching for any sign of the suspects. Then he saw them, two figures in dark clothing, being led out in cuffs. Their faces were hard, unreadable, but Carter could see something in their eyes. They weren't surprised they had been caught. Reynolds pulled up beside them, stepping out of his car with a grim expression. "Security footage confirms it," he said. "Two men disguised as janitors entered the building an hour ago. The hit was planned." He hesitated before adding, "and they had help from the inside." Carter exhaled sharply. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his stomach tighten. Someone in law enforcement had leaked information, and whoever they were, they had nearly gotten away with it. Whittaker stepped forward, his gaze locked on the suspects. Let's see who they roll on first. But before they could approach, a familiar voice called out behind them. Carter turned to see the older officer from earlier, his face pale, his body tense. He looked like a man who had just realized how deep he was in something he couldn't control. I didn't know, the officer said quietly. I swear, I didn't know what they were planning. Carter studied him for a long moment, but you knew something was off, and he still played along. The officer didn't answer. He just looked away, shame creeping into his expression. Harris stepped in. There's an ongoing investigation now. You'll have a chance to talk. Her voice was firm, but there was something else in it too. Finality. Whatever happened next, this officer's career would never be the same. Carter took a deep breath, looking back at City Hall. The worst of the night was over, but the damage had already been done. People had almost died. Trust had been broken, and the fact that law enforcement had been used as a tool in this made it even worse. But as the suspects were led away, Carter knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. There were still people out there who thought they could manipulate the system, who believed they could hide behind their badges and connections. But tonight, they had been exposed, and that was just the beginning.